you, Jessica. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Professor Lee and I today want to present to you about the intake of ultra-processed foods and whether these foods increase the risk of mortality in the Korean population. I'll be referring to them as UPF in the entire presentation. I will start by relating the topic of this presentation and the theme of the conference. We all know how diet really was played a very important role in the outcomes of the victims of the COVID-19 pandemic. We know how the lifestyle factors and the nutritional status of those who were infected by the COVID-19 pandemic influenced their outcomes in terms of mortality. We saw most people who had chronic diseases having high risk of mortality, those with obesity having high risk of mortality compared to those their counterparts. So this really signifies the importance of diet in terms, as far as the COVID-19 pandemic was concerned. I'm going to start by giving a brief background about ultra-processed foods, and then trying to explain what are these ultra-processed foods and how can we identify them. I'm sure most of us probably had an ultra-processed food at lunch, so I'm sure by the end of this presentation we should be able to identify what these foods are, and knowing why I chose this topic as part of the presentation. Previously, the dietary recommendations or the dietary guidelines have been telling us we need to eat a balanced diet, balance your plate, have this kind of food and this one, and then balance the nutrients, reduce the cholesterol intake, and all that. But recently, there's a new dimension of the diet, and this is to what extent is the food we are eating processed? And this is a dimension that is really attracting the scientific community's effort to try to figure out whether the food industry is doing something that is negatively impacting our health. What we see is there are two graphs that show the distribution of the sales of ultra-processed foods in all the 8 continents of the world. And what we see that the sales of ultra-processed foods are more high in the developed countries, but what we see is a rapid proliferation of these sales in the low, what they call the low and middle income countries, especially in the developing world and in less developed countries. And these are the regions of the world that really constitute the largest percentage of the global population, which means that this is likely to represent to have some negative consequences on global public health in as far as consumption of ultra-processed food is concerned, as we shall see. And the next graph is showing us the consumption of ultra-processed foods, their contribution to the daily energy intake. We see that the contribution of ultra-processed foods to the daily dietary energy intake ranges from 20% from Brazil to almost 60% in the UK and USA. So we see a very high consumption of these foods in the developed countries, in Europe especially. And we see that although the consumption is still low in the Southern American and the Asian populations, there are some predictions that the consumption is going to increase by maybe 10 years to come. We pointed out the Korean population here, which will be the focus of the presentation. This population has unique dietary patterns in that although it's considered as a high-income country, the aspects of their traditional pattern is still preserved, characterized by the consumption of vegetables, mainly on their diet, fermented foods, plant-based. But despite that, we see that since the year 2010, we are seeing a very significant increase in specific items of the ultra-processed food category, especially the processed cereals and instant foods, and then sauces and other foods, as we shall see later. So we are seeing a rapid nutritional transition in these countries, and we need to do something about this. What are ultra-processed foods? we used to classify foods as processed. If something is high in oil or fat or high in salt and what, we consider it processed. But that is not enough. There are new systems that have been developed to try to categorize foods based on their degree of processing. The most popular one that is used in research is the NOVA classification. It was developed by Dr. Carlos in Brazil to try to categorize the foods according to the degree of processing. So now you see that you really had an ultra-processed food during lunch. The first group is the unprocessed or the minimally processed foods. These are basically the foods in their natural form, just slightly altered without adding anything to maybe enhance their taste or to increase their shelf life. And the second group are the ingredients that we use in the kitchen to try to prepare the group 1 foods to add taste to them, for example, salt and oil. And then the third group are the processed foods. We have been generalizing the processed foods and ultra-processed food together for the past very many years, but now we have separated them in this new classification called the NOVA. So the processed foods are basically the unprocessed or the minimally processed foods in group 1, combined with some kitchen ingredients and packaged in some way to try to increase their shelf life. And they could have some few ingredients to try to enhance their taste. For example, we can look at bottled juice, which has a very high percentage of the fruit in itself, but with added sugar, and then packaged in a bottle that makes it processed. Then we have tinned foods, for example, beans and fish. And then the fourth category, which is the subject of today's topic, are the ultra-processed foods. They call them foods, but they are more of formulations of industrial grade ingredients. These are the substances extracted from group 1 foods, mixed together with industrial grade ingredients to create new food products. These products contain very high quantities of preservatives. They usually have added colors, artificial flavors in them. For example, you have an apple juice that smells like apple, but it is not actually apple. And then there are sweeteners, there are emulsifiers. And usually you find that the ingredients in these foods are very hard to read. They have hard names. You see them on the packaging material, but you can't read them. They're very complicated. So that's how you will be able to recognize the ultra-processed food. Why are we talking about ultra-processed food? Is that these foods are low or depleted in certain nutrients, important nutrients, for example, vitamins and minerals and fiber, because they are highly processed to try to extend their shelf life. And there are certain things that have been added in them, and they have been subjected to extremely high temperatures, which makes them poor in nutrients and makes them rich in artificially made substances. And a lot of research is actually linking them to a continuum of diseases, ranging from cardiovascular diseases, other metabolic diseases, mental illnesses. We have been talking about mental disorders. There's a correlation between those diseases and consumption of ultra-processed food, according to the research we have. And cancer, a lot of evidence about cancer is emerging, and then premature mortality, which I'm going to be talking about today. Why are these foods linked to all these diseases? Animal studies have shown, we don't have the confirmation in the human population, but the preliminary evidence we have from animal experiments show that these foods alter the gut microorganisms. We have recently learned that the gut microorganisms are very important in regulating very many aspects of our physiology. So these foods they enhance the proliferation of the dangerous microorganisms in our gut and decrease the growth of the good bacteria, which we know that the bad bacteria is responsible for producing a lot of substances and chemicals that are actually important in regulating our appetite and our brain signaling to the gut. So these substances, some of them that are produced by the bad bacteria, lead to systemic inflammation, and they're very important in metabolizing our food, extracting energy from it. So that kind of alteration is related to obesity and other disorders, as we have indicated them here. and then they have been subject to too much temperature during industrial processing. That leads to formation of new substances, many of which are carcinogenic. For example, the advanced glycation end products, the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, they are substances that are very common in meat that have been roasted and subjected to extremely high temperatures. Another way by which they could exert their detrimental effects is by exposing the consumers to endocrine disruption chemicals. These chemicals are mainly in the synthetic packaging materials where they package these foods. So this food subjected under room temperature within the packaging material tends to enhance migration of the plastic chemicals into these foods. These chemicals induce some epigenetic changes that could be related to, could be carcinogenic. And then the food matrix of this food has been altered in some way, which reduces the way they pass through our gut and probably enhance the consumption of glucose, leading to insulin resistance and those mechanisms that explain these disorders. We aimed to investigate whether there is a relationship between eating ultra-processed foods and the risk of dying from all causes, from cancer and from cardiovascular disease. Our main motivation was that you see that most of the studies on ultra-processed foods are concentrating in the European countries here and the US. We have very little studies in the Asian countries, which are actually undergoing a very rapid economic transformation and therefore subjected to the sales of these foods. And in the African countries, we see no studies here on mortality. So we wanted to see are the results from these studies that have been conducted in the Europe, could they be replicated in other populations where the dietary culture could be a little bit different from that in the West. We used the health examinee study cohort. This is part of the Korean Genome and Epidemiological Study cohort study. Yes, trying to investigate the risk factors for chronic diseases. We subjected this kind of cohort to very different exclusion criteria to analyze 113,576 participants. It's quite a large sample. The participants were recruited from 2004 to 2013 and followed up until 2020, where we tried to ascertain whether someone died or survived. In recruiting them and following them up, we measured dietary factors, dietary intake, and some lifestyle factors such as smoking, drinking, and physical activity, socioeconomic status characteristics, and other variables that could influence mortality. And finally, we ascertained all-cause mortality, cancer and CVD mortality using the International Classification of Disease Codes. We considered these foods ultra-processed in the food frequency questionnaire. We computed UPF intake in terms of grams per day and expressing this one as the percentage contribution to the dietary intake. We use advanced statistical methods to try to calculate the risk of dying, comparing those people who consumed high ultra-processed foods and those who consumed low ultra-processed foods. This is the distribution of participants. We see that the major point here, what we notice is that the education income of the participants who consumed high ultra-processed food was high, and most of them stayed in the urban areas of Seoul, which means that consumption of these foods is probably linked to the high socioeconomic status of these people. These graphs show the risk of dying from UPF consumption, comparing highest and lowest consumers. This shows the null risk. On the right side is the increased risk, on the left is the decreased risk. We generally did not find evidence of any association between total ultra-processed food consumption and the risk of dying from all causes or specific causes. We conducted some linear associations to try to see whether increasing intake of ultra-processed food is associated with a corresponding increase in the risk of mortality. We similarly did not find any evidence of that association. We tried to consider individual ultra-processed foods and found that consumption of ultra-processed meat, milk, and soy milk drink in the Korean population increases the risk of mortality in men, and ultra-processed red meat and fish increases the risk of mortality in women. We tried to subject our analysis to sensitivity analysis to see whether there are certain factors that could have introduced some bias in the analysis, but we preserved the results that we found in the main analysis. In general, our findings suggest that they are different from the Western population findings, probably due to the unique dietary patterns in the Korean population. And the socioeconomic factors could have confounded our findings. They could probably have a large impact on mortality compared to dietary factors. That is one of the explanations that we think is connected to these results. And to explain why these results why UPF meat was related to mortality is due to the compounds that are formed during processing of meat that are probably carcinogenic and are linked to heart diseases, which could be a pathway to which they relate to mortality. And then when it comes to the beverages, the ultra-processed milk and soy milk drink, they probably have added sugars in them and other cosmetic additives that could be linked to chronic diseases. These are the limitations of my study and the strengths. I will not go through each of them, but the one I will insist is that we cannot make any causal relationship. It is just a preliminary finding. We suggest that we need more studies in the low middle-income countries or emerging economies which are at risk of these diseases to be sure of the conclusion that UPF intake is actually detrimental to overall health. Thank you so much for listening.